Major Sir William Newenham Montague Orpen, KBE, RA, was an Irish artist who worked mainly in London. William Orpen was a fine draftsman and a popular, commercially successful painter of portraits for the well-to-do in Edwardian society, though many of his most striking paintings are self-portraits. During the First World War, he was the most prolific of the official artists sent by Britain to the Western Front. There he produced drawings and paintings of ordinary soldiers, dead men, and German prisoners of war, as well as portraits of generals and politicians. Most of these works, 138 in all, he donated to the British government and they are now in the collection of the Imperial War Museum. His connections to the senior ranks of the British Army allowed him to stay in France longer than any of the other official war artists, and although he was made a Knight Commander of the Order of the British Empire in the 1918 King's Birthday Honours List, and also elected a member of the Royal Academy of Arts, his determination to serve as a war artist cost him both his health and some of his social standing. After his early death, a number of critics, including other artists, were loudly dismissive of his work, and for many years his paintings were rarely exhibited, a situation that only began to change in the 1980s. Early life. Born in Stillorgan, County Dublin, William Orpen was the fourth and youngest son of Arthur Herbert Orpen, a solicitor, and his wife, Anne Caulfield, the eldest daughter of the Right Rev. Charles Caulfield, the Bishop of Nassau. Both his parents were amateur painters, and his eldest brother, Richard Caulfield Orpen, became a notable architect. The historian Godard Henry Orpen was a second cousin of his. The family lived at Oriel, a large house with extensive grounds containing stables and a tennis court. Orpen appears to have had a happy childhood there. Orpen was a naturally talented painter and was enrolled, aged 13, at the Dublin Metropolitan School of Art. He won every major prize there and also the British Isles Gold Medal for life drawing before leaving to study at the Slade School of Art between 1897 and 1899. At the Slade, Orpen mastered oil painting and began to experiment with different painting techniques and effects. He would include mirrors in his pictures to create images within images, add false frames and collages around his subjects, and often make pictorial references to works by other artists in his own paintings. His 2-meter-wide painting, The Play Scene from Hamlet, won the Slade Composition Prize in 1899. Orpen's teachers at the Slade included Henry Tonks, Philip Wilson Steer and Frederick Brown, all of whom were members of the New English Art Club. They ensured he exhibited there in 1899, and that he became a member in 1900. Orpen's The Mirror, shown at the NEAC in 1900, references both Jan van Eyck's Anna Finney portrait of 1434 and also elements of 17th-century Dutch interiors, such as muted tones and deep shadows. Orpen depicted the Anna Finney convex glass in several other paintings, including a mere fracture in 1901. During this period, whilst at the Slade, Orpen became engaged to Emily Scoble, a model and the subject of The Mirror. In 1901, she ended the relationship and Orpen married Grace Newstubb, the sister-in-law of Sir William Rothenstein. Orpen and Newstubb had 3 daughters together, but the marriage was not a happy one, and, by 1908, Orpen had begun a long-running affair with Mrs. Evelyn St. George, a well-connected American millionairess based in London, and with whom he also had a child. Early career. After he left the Slade, from 1903 to 1907, Orpen ran a private teaching studio, the Chelsea Art School, with his fellow Slade graduate Augustus John. Between 1902 and 1915, Orpen divided his time between London and Dublin. He taught at the Dublin Metropolitan School of Art, where his pupils included Sean Keating, Grace Gifford, Patrick Tui, Leo Whelan and Margaret Clark. This was the period of the Celtic Revival in Ireland, and responding to the growth of new literary and other cultural developments, Orpen painted 3 large allegorical paintings: Sowing New Seed, The Western Wedding and The Holy Well. A key figure in the Celtic Revival was ULAN, who was a friend and mentor to Orpen, and who began collecting Impressionist artworks with Orpen's guidance. In the summer of 1904, Orpen and Lane visited Paris and Madrid together, and some years later Lane commissioned a series of portraits of contemporary Irish figures from Orpen for the Municipal Gallery of Modern Art in Dublin. From 1908 onwards, Orpen exhibited works in the Royal Academy on a regular basis. Between 1908 and 1912, Orpen and his family spent the summer on the coast at Howth, north of Dublin, where he began painting in the open air and developed a distinctive plein air style that featured figures composed of touches of colour without a drawn outline. The most notable of these works was Midday on the Beach, shown at the NEAC in 1910. Between 1911 and 1913, in London, Orpen painted a series of mostly three-quarter-length portraits of Vera Brewster, the wife of the writer Joe Horn, which included the paintings The Roscommon Dragoon, The Irish Volunteer and The Angler. John Singer Sargent promoted Orpen's work, and he soon built a lucrative reputation in both London and Dublin for painting society portraits. Mrs. Street, George, and Lady Rock Savage both demonstrate Orpen's ability to produce the swagger portraits that Edwardian high society greatly valued. Group portraits of a type known as conversation pieces were also hugely popular, and Orpen painted several, most notably the Café Royal in London, and Homage to Manet, which showed Walter Sickert and several other artists and critics seated in front of Edouard Manet's portrait of Eva González. By the start of World War I, Orpen was the most famous and most commercially successful artist working in Britain. World War I. In December 1915, Orpen was commissioned into the Army Service Corps and reported for clerical duty at London's Kensington Barracks in March 1916. Throughout 1916, Orpen continued painting portraits, most notably one of a despondent Winston Churchill, but soon started using both his own contacts and those of Evelyn St. George to secure a war artist posting. Orpen knew both Philip Sassoon, the private secretary to Douglas Haig, and also Sir John Cowans, the Quartermaster General of the British Army. In January 1917, the Daily Mirror reported that Haig himself had conferred on Orpen the title of an official artist with the British Army in France. The Department of Information, which was actually running the British War Artist Scheme, were given little choice but to accept the situation, while the other artists on the department scheme were given an honorary rank of second lieutenant and restricted to 3 weeks visiting the Western Front. Orpen was made a major and given indefinite leave to be at the front. An officer from Kensington Barracks was appointed as his military aide. A car and driver were made available in France, and Orpen paid for a batman and assistant to accompany him. In April 1917, Orpen travelled to the Somme and based himself in Amiens. Orpen had arrived on the Somme 3 weeks after the German forces had pulled back to the Hindenburg Line. Each day Orpen would be driven to locations such as Thiepval, Beaumont-Hamel or Villers-le-Bruxelles to sketch Allied troops or German prisoners and record the devastation left by the Battle of the Somme amid the frozen and desolate landscape. However, he didn't submit any work to the Department of Information or to the military censor. When he was reprimanded for that, he had Haig's office move the officer who had issued the reprimand to other duties. In May 1917, he painted portraits of both Haig and Sir Hugh Trenchard, the commander of the Royal Flying Corps, and both of these images were widely reproduced in British newspapers and magazines. In June, Orpen moved to the Ypres salient and stayed at Castle in the Hotel Sauvage, where he painted the self-portrait known as Ready to Start. The Somme battlefield. Orpen returned to the Somme in August 1917 and found the landscape transformed. Writing in 1921, Orpen described the scene: "I had left it mud, nothing but water, shell holes and mud, the most gloomy, dreary abomination of desolation the mind could imagine. And now, in the summer of 1917, no words could express the beauty of it. The dreary, dismal mud was baked white and pure, dazzling white. White daisies, red poppies and a blue flower, great masses of them, stretched for miles and miles. The sky a pure dark blue, and the whole air up to a height of about 40 feet, thick with white butterflies. Your clothes were covered with butterflies. It was like an enchanted land. But in the place of fairs there were thousands of little white crosses marked unknown British soldier, for the most part." Orpen was well aware that this landscape was a vast graveyard. Throughout the summer of 1917, other than Orpen and his driver and assistant, the only people on the empty battlefield around Thiepval were the British and Allied burial parties working to identify and into the thousands of bodies left in the open or in abandoned trenches and dugouts. As he traveled across this landscape, Orpen frequently encountered dead bodies and human remains, often little more, he wrote, than skulls, bones, garments. On the Somme, Orpen pushed himself to find artistic and pictorial strategies adequate to the situation. He stopped using half-tones and half-shades and adopted a new palette of colors, characterized by the extensive use of weak purples, mauves and bright green, with large wide spaces representing the effect of bright sunlight on the chalk soil, all under a strong cobalt blue sky. In Dead Germans in a Trench, his use of blue-green for the bodies indicates putrefaction, while the bright coloring of the trench increases the disturbing sense of the picture. Amid the derelict trenches, Orpen claimed to have encountered soldiers who had been traumatized and shell-shocked by the fighting and made at least 2 paintings, A Man with a Cigarette and Blown Up Mad, based on these meetings. Others regard the 2 figures as purely allegorical representations of sacrifice and suffering. In particular, the soldier in Blown Up Mad has been likened to early Renaissance depictions of the risen Christ emerging from the tomb. Following the success of his Haig and Trenchard portraits, Orpen was asked to paint portraits of several pilots in the Royal Flying Corps. He spent part of September 1917 visiting airfields, and during October 1917 he was based with No. 56 Squadron near Castle. His portrait of Lieutenant Reginald Hodge, MC in Bar, was painted a few hours after the young pilot had been in a dogfight, and Orpen was greatly impressed by his calmness. Orpen's portrait of Arthur Rhys-Davids, DSO MC, is also crisply drawn with rich colors and lush shadows. Rhys-Davids was killed in combat within a week of sitting for Orpen, and Orpen's portrait of him was used as the cover illustration of the next edition of War Pictorial magazine and widely reproduced elsewhere after that. The refugee. Late in 1917, Orpen spent 2 weeks in hospital with blood poisoning. There he met a young volunteer Red Cross worker from Lille named Yvonne Orbic. The two began a relationship that was to last 10 years, and Orpen painted several portraits of her. 2 of these he submitted to the official censor early in 1918. Orpen named both paintings a spy. In March 1918 was interviewed by the military censor responsible for the war artists, Lieutenant Colonel A.N. Lee. Lee made it clear that if the title was intended as a joke it was in very bad taste, coming so soon after the execution of Mata Hari, but if the subject really was a spy then Orpen could be facing a court-martial. Orpen gave Lee a fantastical story that the woman in the picture was a German spy who had been executed by the French but who, in an attempt to save herself, had at the last moment revealed herself naked in front of the firing squad. Lee knew the story was nonsense and had Orpen recalled to London to be reprimanded at the War Office. There, Orpen retracted the firing squad story but was ordered to remain in London. Orpen ignored this and, quite illegally, made his way back to France. There he contrived to receive a phone call from Haig's private office, within earshot of several of Lee's colleagues from Army Intelligence, inviting him to dinner with Haig to discuss what he would like to paint next. Lee dropped his objections to Orpen working in France, and Orpen agreed to rename the two pictures The Refugee. As the war progressed, Orpen and Lee became good friends. Orpen painted two portraits of him. They went drinking together in London and maintained a lively correspondence until Orpen's death. It is not clear how well known this friendship was during their lives, but if it was known of in Dublin it would have caused consternation and real pain in several quarters. Not only had Lee been the brigade major sent to Dublin to put down 1916 Easter Rising, he had been the officer in charge of arranging several of the executions that followed the fighting, including that of Joseph Plunkett, the husband of Grace Gifford, Orpen's star pupil from his teaching days. In fact, between enlisting in the British Army in 1915 and his death in 1931, Orpen spent only a single day, in 1918, in Ireland. In May 2010, a third version of The Refugee surfaced on the Antiques Roadshow television program. The Imperial War Museum had assured its owner that it was a copy by someone other than Orpen, but the program's art expert, Rupert Mars, determined it was painted by Orpen himself as a thank you present to Lord Beaverbrick for helping him avoid being court-martialed in March 1918. The picture was estimated to be worth £250,000. Recognition. In May 1918, 125 of Orpen's war paintings and drawings were displayed at Agnew's Galleries in Old Bond Street in London. The exhibition was a great success, with 9,000 paying visitors in its 4 weeks. Highlights of the exhibition included 9 of Orpen's khaki portraits and several of his works from the Somme, such as Highlander Passing a Grave, and Thinker on the Butte at Walland Court. There was much press discussion as to why the censor had passed Orpen's Dead Germans in a Trench as suitable for display, after his refusal to allow Christopher Nevenson's Paths of Glory to be displayed 2 months previously. In fact, Arthur Lee had refused to pass nearly all of the paintings shown at Agnew's, but Orpen appealed to the Director of Military Intelligence, General George MacDonough, and had him overruled. After Agnew's, several museums and galleries wanted to host the exhibition, and it was taken to the Manchester City Art Gallery and then the United States. Whilst the exhibition was in London, it was announced that Orpen was donating all the works on display to the British government on the understanding that they should remain in their white frames and be kept together as a single body of work. They are now in the collection of the Imperial War Museum in London. In the King's birthday honours list that summer he was made a Knight Commander of the Order of the British Empire. 1918 Orpen returned to France in July and spent a second summer painting on the old Somme battlefield and making frequent trips to Paris to complete a series of portraits of Canadian commanders. Later he painted the immediate aftermath of the fighting at Zonnebaker that took place during the Fifth Battle of Ypres. Orpen made it clear he wished to remain in France and was keen to work in the newly liberated towns. By the end of the summer of 1918, Orpen was mentally exhausted and his works became increasingly theatrical, less realistic and more allegorical. In Harvest, which shows women tending a grave covered in barbed wire, he used a garish palette of colors to emphasize the unreal nature of the scene. Whilst Bombing, Night and Adam and Eve at Perron seem somewhat flawed compositions, other paintings were far more successful. Most notably The Mad Woman of Douai, a harrowing depiction of the aftermath of a rape. When Orpen met the women some time afterwards, she was silent and motionless, except for one thumb which constantly twitched. The two soldiers in the picture are both figures borrowed from other paintings of his, as is the grave in the foreground. Orpen had been shocked to see a number of such burial mounds with, as he wrote, arms and feet showing in lots of cases. As the war entered its final stages, Orpen witnessed scenes which he found increasingly macabre. One day, even the broad-minded Orpen was shocked to encounter 3 young French prostitutes offering the services next to a burial party at a gravesite. Towards the end of the war he painted a handful of parable paintings, such as Armistice Night, Amiens and the official entry of the Kaiser, that used black humor to reimagine the coming victory. Most of these paintings were never displayed in public after the war. In November 1918, Orpen collapsed and became seriously ill. Yvonne Orbeck spent 2 months nursing him before he moved to Paris in January 1919 to begin work on his next commission, the Peace Conference. When the war ended, the Imperial War Museum commissioned Orpen to stay in France and paint 3 large group portraits of the delegates to Paris Peace Conference. Throughout 1919 he painted individual portraits of the delegates to the conference, and these formed the basis of his 2 large paintings, A Peace Conference at the Quai d'Orsay and The Signing of Peace in the Hall of Mirrors. In both pictures the architecture overwhelms the gathered politicians and statesmen whose political wranglings and vainglory had diminished them in Orpen's eyes. Orpen considered that the whole conference was being conducted with a lack of respect or regard to the suffering of the soldiers who fought in the war, and he attempted to address this in the 3rd painting of the commission. This picture was to show the delegates and military leaders as they entered the Hall of Mirrors to sign the Treaty of Versailles. Orpen sent Evelyn St. George a letter detailing the original layout and composition of the work. Haig and Marshal Foch were at the center, with the other delegates either side of them. Among the delegates, Orpen included 2 additional figures, a Grenadier Guard Sergeant and Arthur Rhys-Davids, the young fighter pilot he had painted the week before he was killed in 1917. After working on this composition for 9 months, Orpen painted over all the figures and replaced them with a coffin covered by the Union Jack and flanked by a pair of ghostly and wretched soldiers, clothed in rags. Actually, the figure from the painting blown up, mad, with 2 cherubs above them supporting garlands of flowers. This painting, now known as To the Unknown British Soldier in France, was first exhibited in 1923 at the Royal Academy. The public voted it Picture of the Year, but almost all of the critics who reviewed the picture condemned it, and from a handful of critics and newspapers, Orpen received sustained abuse and was accused of bad taste, technical ineptitude and, for the 2 figures either side of the coffin, sacrilege. Orpen had received some letters of appreciation from ex-servicemen and from family members of soldiers who had died in the war. but he still felt the need to issue a statement explaining the picture and his intentions. However, it was clearly not the group portrait the Imperial War Museum had commissioned, and they refused to accept it. The picture remained in Orpen's studio until 1928, when, on his own initiative, he offered to paint out the cherubs and the soldiers if that would make it acceptable to the museum. The then director of the IWM replied that he would be happy to accept the picture as it was, or however Orpen wished to present it. Orpen painted out the soldiers and the painting was accepted by the museum in 1928. Later life. After the war, Orpen returned to painting society portraits and, commercially, enjoyed great success. He was never short of portrait commissions to work on, and throughout the 1920s often earned £35,000 per year and could easily charge 2,000 guineas for a picture. Throughout the 1920s he maintained homes and studios in both Paris and London and exhibited at the Royal Academy each year. His 1921 RA submission was a portrait of the head chef at the Hotel Chatham in Paris. The Tate Gallery were keen to acquire the painting using funds from the Chantry bequest. After Orpen assured the Tate that picture met the conditions required by the bequest and that he had painted the picture entirely in Britain, the Tate announced the purchase. Several people then came forward to say that they had seen Orpen paint the picture in Paris. Orpen withdrew from the purchase and gave the Tate a portrait of Sir William Symington McCormick instead. Orpen subsequently submitted Le Chef de Hotel Chatham, Paris to the Royal Academy as his diploma painting. Orpen's wartime memoir, An Onlooker in France, 1917–1919, was published in 1921, and all the proceeds donated to war charities. In 1925 Orpen painted Sunlight, a brilliant depiction, in dappled sunlight, of a model behind whom hangs the Senate Marley, the 1874 painting by Monet which Orpen owned. In 1923 Arthur Lee introduced Orpen to Edward, the Prince of Wales, and secured Orpen a commission to paint the Prince for the Royal and Ancient Golf Club at St. Andrews. A long series of disagreements followed between the Prince's advisers, who wanted a formal portrait, and Orpen, who wanted to paint Edward in his golf clothes. Orpen got his way, but it was not until 1928 that the R&AMP put the painting on display. In 1927, Orpen accepted a commission to paint a portrait of David Lloyd George, but the completed work was rejected as being too informal for such a senior politician. The painting remained with Orpen and was only purchased by the National Portrait Gallery after his death. In 1928 Orpen stood for election as President of the Royal Academy but lost to Sir William Llewellyn. Self-portraits. Orpen created many self-portraits during his lifetime. He often portrayed himself in the act of painting and often created multiple images of himself. Whilst at the Slade he painted a double portrait of himself and Augustus John in the Nell Gwyn Tavern in London. In 1913 Orpen painted himself with a golden version of his painting showing new seed as a background. Self-portrait as Chardin from 1908 shows Orpen as the painter Jean-Baptiste Siméon Chardin at an easel painting the same image. A year earlier he had painted a head and shoulders self-portrait after Chardin's 1776 work Self-Portrait with Pince-Nez. Orpen's 1910 self-portrait Leading the Life in the West has been read as a reference to the 1907 play The Playboy of the Western World, by John Millington Synge, who Orpen knew and greatly liked. During World War I, Orpen painted at least 3 self-portraits that ranged from the optimistic tones of Ready to Start in June 1917, to more somber depictions painted only a few months later. Bruce Arnold noted Orpen's interest in self-portraiture. His self-portraits are often searching and dramatic. He once painted himself as a jockey, and in his The Dead Ptarmigan, a self-portrait in the National Gallery of Ireland, he scowls from the frame while holding a dead ptarmigan at head height. There. In May 1931, Orpen became seriously ill and, after suffering periods of memory loss, died aged 52 in London on the 29th of September 1931, and was buried at Putney Vale Cemetery. A stone tablet in the island of Ireland Peace Park Memorial, Messines, Belgique, commemorates him.